In the darkest corners of human history, some stories demand to be told. This is one of them. Subscribe to the channel now. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. The morning mist clung to Blackwood Plantation like a shroud, carrying with it the weight of decades of suffering. In the pre-dawn darkness of 1855, the sound of heavy boots echoed across the wooden planks of the overseer's quarters. Thomas the fighter. Blackwood emerged from his cabin, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the faint light of dawn. At 42 years old, Thomas had earned his nickname through 29 brutal encounters, 29 lives extinguished by his bare hands. Each death had carved another line into his weathered face, another layer of callousness around his heart. The plantation workers whispered his name in hushed tones, their eyes darting away whenever he passed. The cabin he emerged from was a testament to his brutal reign. Unlike the cramped, leaking quarters where the workers lived, Thomas's dwelling was spacious and well-maintained. The walls were adorned with trophies of his violence, a collection of personal items taken from his victims. A pocket watch here, a wedding ring there, each one a reminder of a life he had snuffed out. In the corner sat a wooden chair, where he would sit each evening, cleaning his hands methodically while planning the next day's cruelties. The morning ritual was always the same. Thomas would emerge at precisely 5:30, his presence alone enough to wake those workers who might still be sleeping. He carried with him a leather-bound ledger where he recorded each worker's daily output, marking those who fell short for special attention. The ledger was stained with blood and sweat, its pages filled with the careful documentation of human misery. "Another day in paradise," Thomas muttered, cracking his knuckles as he surveyed his domain. The irony wasn't lost on him. This place was hell on earth, and he was its chief demon. The sound of his knuckles popping was like the breaking of small bones, a sound that had become synonymous with death on the plantation. The plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Georgia soil, its cotton fields extending beyond the horizon. 200 souls labored under Thomas's iron rule, their lives hanging by the thread of his volatile temper. Master William Blackwood, Thomas's younger brother, had long since retreated to the comfort of the main house, leaving the day-to-day brutality to his older sibling. The arrangement suited both men perfectly. William maintained plausible deniability, while Thomas indulged his sadistic nature without restraint. As the sun began its reluctant climb, the workers emerged from their quarters like ghosts materializing from the shadows. Among them was Samuel, an elderly man whose back bore the scars of countless lashings. His eyes, though dimmed by years of suffering, still held a flicker of defiance that Thomas had never quite managed to extinguish. Samuel had been on the plantation longer than anyone, having arrived as a young man 30 years earlier. He had witnessed every one of Thomas's kills, each death etching itself deeper into his memory. The quarters where the workers lived were a stark contrast to Thomas's comfortable cabin. Rows of wooden shacks, barely large enough for a family, lined the dirt road that led to the fields. The roofs leaked when it rained, the walls offered little protection from the cold, and the floors were nothing more than packed earth. Children huddled together for warmth, while their parents prepared for another day of back-breaking labor. "Morning, Samuel," Thomas called out, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness that made the old man's skin crawl. "Ready for another productive day?" Samuel nodded silently, knowing that any response could trigger the overseer's wrath. He had witnessed Thomas's first kill 20 years ago, a young man named Joshua who had dared to speak back. The memory still haunted Samuel's dreams, the sickening sound of fists meeting flesh, the desperate gasps for air, and finally, the terrible silence. That day had established the pattern that would define the next 2 decades: absolute submission or death. The plantation bell rang out across the fields, its bronze voice calling the workers to their daily torment. The bell had been cast in Charleston and bore an inscription that read, "Liberty and justice for all," a cruel irony that wasn't lost on those who heard its daily summons. Thomas watched with satisfaction as they filed past him, their heads bowed in submission. This was his kingdom, built on fear and maintained through violence. "You there?" Thomas barked at a young woman carrying a water bucket. "Move faster. The cotton won't pick itself." The woman, barely 18, quickened her pace, water sloshing from the bucket as she hurried toward the fields. Her name was Mary, and she had arrived at the plantation only 6 months earlier, sold away from her family to settle a debt. Thomas had taken a particular interest in her, and she lived in constant fear of drawing his attention. Thomas smiled grimly as he watched her stumble in her haste. Fear was the most effective motivator he had ever discovered. As the morning progressed, Thomas made his rounds through the plantation. His presence alone was enough to increase the workers' pace, their hands moving frantically through the cotton bolls as they tried to avoid his attention. He paused occasionally to bark orders or deliver a swift blow to anyone he deemed too slow. The cotton plants stood in endless rows, their white bowls ready for harvest, but the beauty of the crop was tainted by the blood and tears of those who tended it. Near the eastern fields, he encountered Marcus, a strong young man who had arrived at the plantation only 6 months earlier. Unlike the others, Marcus didn't immediately lower his eyes when Thomas approached. There was something in his gaze, not defiance exactly, but a quiet strength that irritated the overseer. The young man's hands were calloused from hard work, but there was a precision to his movements that suggested training beyond simple farm labor. Marcus had been purchased from a plantation in South Carolina, his previous owner claiming he was a troublemaker who needed a firmer hand. The bill of sale had described him as strong but willful, a combination that usually meant a quick death under Thomas's supervision. Yet somehow, Marcus had survived his first 6 months, keeping his head down while his eyes missed nothing. "Problem with your vision, boy?" Thomas growled, stepping closer to Marcus. "No, sir," Marcus replied evenly, his voice steady despite the danger he was courting. Thomas studied the young man's face, noting the strong jawline and intelligent eyes. Something about Marcus reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. The feeling unsettled him in a way he didn't like. There was a familiarity to the young man's features that tugged at memories Thomas preferred to keep buried. "Well then, get back to work," Thomas snapped, turning away. As he walked off, he missed the way Marcus's hands clenched into fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening with barely controlled emotion. But Samuel, working nearby, noticed the young man's reaction and felt a chill of recognition run down his spine. The day wore on, with its usual rhythm of labor and intimidation. Thomas's reputation preceded him wherever he went, and the workers scattered like leaves before a storm whenever he appeared. By noon the heat had become oppressive, and even Thomas felt the sweat beading on his forehead as he continued his patrol. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly, turning the cotton fields into a furnace where human beings were the fuel. It was during the lunch break that the first whispers began. Samuel, sitting in the shade of an old oak tree, leaned close to another worker and spoke in hushed tones. The oak tree was ancient, its gnarled branches providing one of the few sources of comfort on the plantation. Some said it had been there since before the first slaves arrived, a silent witness to decades of suffering. "That new boy, Marcus," Samuel said quietly. "How you see the way he looks at the fighter?" The other worker, a middle-aged woman named Ruth, nodded nervously. Ruth had been on the plantation for 15 years, long enough to develop an instinct for trouble. She had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, and she sensed something building between Marcus and Thomas. "Like he knows something the rest of us don't." "Maybe he does," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible. "Maybe he knows exactly who he's looking at." Samuel's words carried the weight of experience. He had seen young men arrive at the plantation before, filled with anger and dreams of revenge. Most of them were dead within a month, their spirits broken by Thomas's relentless brutality. But Marcus was different somehow, and that difference both thrilled and terrified the old man. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Thomas appeared around the corner of a storage shed, his eyes scanning the group of resting workers. His gaze lingered on Samuel for a moment longer than necessary, and the old man felt his heart skip a beat. "Break's over," Thomas shouted. "Back to work, all of you." As the workers reluctantly rose to their feet, Thomas noticed Marcus standing apart from the group. The young man was staring directly at him, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. "You got something to say, boy?" Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Marcus shook his head slowly. but didn't break eye contact. "No, sir, nothing at all." But Thomas could see it in the young man's eyes. There was definitely something that made his skin crawl and his fists itch for violence. He had built his reputation on reading people, on knowing when someone was about to challenge him. And Marcus, despite his outward compliance, was definitely a challenge waiting to happen. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, Thomas found himself repeatedly drawn back to where Marcus was working. The young man labored with quiet efficiency, never complaining, never slowing down. But there was an intensity to his movements, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. His hands moved through the cotton with practiced ease, but his eyes never stopped watching, learning, planning. The other workers had begun to notice too. They cast nervous glances between Marcus and Thomas, sensing the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. Some of the older workers remembered what had happened the last time someone had dared to challenge the fighter's authority. The memory of that confrontation still sent shivers down their spines. As evening approached and the workday neared its end, Thomas made his final rounds. The workers were exhausted, their clothes soaked with sweat, their hands raw from handling the rough cotton plants. But they had met their quotas, and Thomas grudgingly acknowledged their productivity. The daily quota system was one of his innovations, a way to squeeze every ounce of labor from the workers while providing justification for punishment when they fell short. It was then that he noticed Marcus had stopped working. The young man stood in the middle of the cotton field, his eyes fixed on the overseer with an intensity that made Thomas's blood run cold. Around them, the other workers had begun to gather, forming a loose circle as if drawn by some invisible force. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the very earth was holding its breath. "What's this about?" Thomas demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the whip at his belt. Marcus said nothing, but he began walking slowly toward the overseer. Each step was deliberate, measured, and filled with a purpose that 20 years of violence had taught Thomas to recognize. This wasn't just another worker who had finally snapped under the pressure. This was something else entirely, something that had been building for far longer than 6 months. The circle of workers tightened around them, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation. Samuel stood among them, his old eyes bright with something that might have been hope. He alone seemed to understand what was about to unfold, and the knowledge filled him with both terror and exhilaration. "Boy, you better stop right there," Thomas warned, his voice carrying the menace that had cowed hundreds of workers over the years. But Marcus didn't stop. He continued his steady approach until he stood just 10 feet away from the overseer. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and clear, cutting through the evening air like a blade. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he said, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "And I think it's time we had a conversation." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Thomas felt his world shift slightly on its axis. There was something about the name Johnson that tugged at his memory, something that made his stomach clench with an emotion he had long since buried. The name echoed in his mind, bringing with it fragments of memory that he had tried desperately to forget. As the sun began to set behind the cotton fields, casting long shadows across the plantation, Thomas Blackwood found himself facing something he had never encountered before, someone who wasn't afraid of him. And for the first time in 20 years, the fighter felt the cold touch of fear creeping up his spine. The name Johnson reverberated through Thomas's mind like a death knell. 20 years of buried memories came rushing back with the force of a dam bursting. Joshua Johnson, his first kill. A young man barely 20 years old who had dared to defend his pregnant wife from Thomas's advances. The confrontation had been swift and brutal, ending with Joshua's lifeless body crumpled in the dirt, while his wife screamed in anguish. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Thomas could still smell the honeysuckle that had been blooming near the slave quarters that day, still hear the sound of Sarah Johnson's sobs echoing across the plantation. He remembered the way Joshua's blood had looked on his knuckles, dark and sticky in the afternoon sun. Most of all, he remembered the moment when the light had faded from Joshua's eyes, the exact instant when a man became a corpse. "Johnson," Thomas repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The circle of workers seemed to lean in, sensing the shift in the overseer's demeanor. The name carried weight here, a significance that went beyond simple identification. It was a name that had been whispered in the slave quarters for 20 years, passed down like a cautionary tale from one generation to the next. Marcus's eyes never wavered. Not so common when it belonged to my father. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against a fence post. The wooden rail was rough against his palm, splinters digging into his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the shock of recognition that coursed through his body. Around them, the workers exchanged meaningful glances. Samuel stepped forward slightly, his weathered face creased with grim satisfaction. The old man had been waiting for this moment for 2 decades. He had watched Thomas's first kill, had held Sarah Johnson as she wept over her husband's body, had helped dig the shallow grave where Joshua's remains still lay. Samuel had promised the dying woman that someday, somehow, justice would come to Blackwood Plantation. Now, looking at Marcus, he believed that promise might finally be kept. "Your father," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "And who might that have been?" "Joshua Johnson," Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "A good man who died trying to protect his family from a monster." Thomas's mind raced back to that terrible day in 1835. He could still see Joshua's face, young and defiant, standing between Thomas and his wife Sarah. The argument had started over something trivial. Sarah had spilled water while serving Thomas his lunch. But Thomas had been drinking, and his temper had flared beyond reason. The whiskey had been flowing freely that day, as Master William was entertaining guests from Charleston, and Thomas had been sampling the hospitality with increasing enthusiasm. The confrontation had begun in the kitchen of the main house. Sarah, heavily pregnant and moving slowly, had been serving the midday meal when her swollen belly had bumped against the table, causing a pitcher of water to overturn. The liquid had splashed across Thomas's boots, and in his drunken state, he had seen it as a deliberate act of disrespect. "She needs to learn some manners," Thomas had slurred, grabbing Sarah's arm roughly. "Take your hands off my wife," Joshua had said, stepping between them. Joshua had appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, his face set with determination despite the obvious danger. He was a small man, barely 5.5 feet tall, but he carried himself with a dignity that made him seem larger. His hands were calloused from years of field work, his clothes patched and worn, but his eyes burned with a fierce love for his wife and unborn child. The confrontation had escalated quickly. Thomas, already known for his violent tendencies, had seen the challenge as an opportunity to establish his dominance. The fight had been one-sided from the start. Joshua, though brave, was no match for Thomas's size and brutality. The beating had lasted only minutes, but those minutes had felt like hours to the horrified witnesses. Now, 20 years later, Thomas found himself face to face with the son of the man he had murdered. The irony was not lost on him. He had created his own nemesis with his first act of violence. The child Sarah had been carrying that day had grown into the man standing before him now, shaped by loss and hardened by the knowledge of his father's fate. "So you've come for revenge," Thomas said, trying to regain his composure. "Is that it, boy?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I've come for justice. There's a difference." The distinction was lost on Thomas, but the workers around them seemed to understand. They had lived under his tyranny for so long that the concept of justice had become almost foreign. Yet here stood Marcus, embodying the possibility that their suffering might finally have meaning. Justice was a word that had been absent from the plantation vocabulary for so long that it sounded almost foreign when spoken aloud. The workers began to murmur among themselves, their voices growing bolder as they processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another confrontation between overseer and worker. This was the past coming back to demand payment for old debts. Some of the older workers remembered Joshua Johnson, remembered the way he had carried himself with quiet dignity, the way he had always been ready to help a neighbor in need. "Justice," Thomas laughed bitterly, but the sound was hollow and forced. "In case you haven't noticed, boy, there ain't no justice on this plantation. There's only power, and I've got it all." "Power built on fear doesn't last forever," Marcus replied. "Eventually, someone comes along who isn't afraid." Thomas studied the young man's face more carefully now, seeing the resemblance to Joshua that had been nagging at him all day. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same quiet dignity that had so infuriated him 20 years ago. But there was something else in Marcus's face, something that hadn't been present in his father's, a hardness born of loss, a strength forged in the fires of grief and determination. Marcus had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. After his mother's death in childbirth, he had been raised by his maternal grandmother, a woman who had filled his head with stories of his father's courage and his mother's love. She had told him about the plantation where his parents had lived and died, about the monster who had destroyed his family. When she died, Marcus had made a promise at her graveside. He would find Thomas Blackwood and make him pay for what he had done. "Your mother," Thomas said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Sarah. What happened to her?" Marcus's composure cracked slightly, a flash of pain crossing his features. "She died giving birth to me. The shock of losing my father, the stress of being alone. It was too much for her." The revelation hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had not only killed Joshua, but had indirectly caused Sarah's death as well. 2 lives destroyed by his moment of rage, and now their son stood before him, seeking retribution. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, heavier than any load he had ever carried. Sarah Johnson had been barely 19 when she died, alone and afraid in a cabin that smelled of blood and sorrow. The midwife who attended her birth had told the story many times over the years, how Sarah had called out for Joshua in her final moments, how she had wept for the husband who would never see his son, how she had used her last breath to whisper a prayer that her child would grow up strong and free. Samuel stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I was there that day," he said, addressing the circle of workers. "I saw what this man did to Joshua Johnson, beat him to death with his bare hands while his pregnant wife begged for mercy." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many of the workers had heard whispers of Thomas's first kill, but few knew the details. Samuel's testimony gave weight to Marcus's claim and legitimacy to his presence. The old man's words painted a picture of brutality that even the hardened workers found shocking in its cruelty. The circle of workers pressed closer, their faces showing a mixture of horror and fascination. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a reckoning 20 years in the making. Some of them had children of their own, and they could imagine the rage that would consume them if someone harmed their families. They saw in Marcus not just a man seeking revenge, but a son honoring his parents' memory. "That's enough," Thomas roared, his hand moving to his whip. "I don't care who this boy thinks he is. He's just another worker, and he'll follow my rules like everyone else." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew they rang hollow. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The workers were no longer looking at him with the same fear. Instead, their eyes were fixed on Marcus, waiting to see what would happen next. The spell of terror that had held the plantation in its grip for 2 decades was beginning to crack, and Thomas could feel his power slipping away like sand through his fingers. Marcus began to remove his shirt, revealing a muscular torso marked by scars, evidence of the hard life he had lived since his parents' deaths. "I've been preparing for this moment my entire life," he said quietly. "Learning to fight, getting stronger, waiting for the day I could face you." The scars on Marcus's body told the story of his journey to this moment. There was the long, thin line across his ribs from a knife fight in New Orleans, the puckered mark on his shoulder from a bullet wound received while helping other slaves escape to freedom. Each scar was a lesson learned, a step on the path that had led him back to the place where his story began. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a spontaneous confrontation, it was a carefully planned reckoning. Marcus had come to the plantation with a purpose, and that purpose was standing right in front of him. The young man had spent years tracking down information about his parents' killer, following rumors and whispered stories, until he had finally found his way to Blackwood Plantation. "You think you can take me, boy?" Thomas asked, beginning to remove his own shirt. His body, though older, was still formidable, a testament to years of physical labor and violence. "I've killed 29 men with these hands. What makes you think you'll be any different?" "Because I'm not fighting for myself," Marcus replied. "I'm fighting for everyone you've hurt, for my father, for my mother, for every person on this plantation who's lived in fear of you." The words struck a chord with the watching workers. For the first time in years, they saw hope, not just for Marcus's victory, but for their own liberation. The circle around the two men tightened, creating an arena of sorts in the fading daylight. The very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Thomas cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing across the plantation like gunshots. He had built his reputation on moments like this, and despite his unease, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before a fight. His hands were weapons honed by years of violence, each knuckle scarred from countless impacts with human flesh and bone. "Your father said something similar before I killed him," Thomas taunted, hoping to rattle Marcus's composure. "Talked about protecting his family, about standing up to bullies. Look how that worked out for him." But Marcus didn't take the bait. Instead, he smiled grimly, and for a moment, Thomas saw Joshua's face looking back at him across the years. "The difference is, I know what I'm walking into. My father was caught off guard by your brutality. I've been expecting it my whole life." The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Marcus had grown up knowing that his father's killer was still alive, still terrorizing innocent people. He had spent years preparing for this confrontation, both physically and mentally. He had studied Thomas's fighting style through the stories of survivors, had trained his body to withstand punishment, had steeled his mind for the violence to come. Thomas began to circle Marcus, looking for an opening. The young man moved with a fluid grace that spoke of training and discipline. This wouldn't be like his previous fights against desperate, untrained workers. Marcus was a different kind of opponent entirely, one who had come prepared for war. "Last chance to walk away, boy," Thomas growled. "I might let you live if you get on your knees and beg." Marcus's response was to raise his fists in a fighting stance. "I didn't come here to beg. I came here to finish what my father started." The workers held their collective breath as the two men faced each other in the gathering dusk. 20 years of pain, anger, and injustice had led to this moment. The son of Thomas's first victim had returned to claim his inheritance, not of land or money, but of justice long denied. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas Blackwood prepared to face the consequences of his past. For the first time in his violent career, he was fighting someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The outcome would determine not just the fate of two men, but the future of everyone on Blackwood Plantation. Thomas threw the first punch. Thomas's massive fist cut through the air with the speed and force of a sledgehammer, but Marcus was no longer where it had been aimed. The young man had slipped to the side with practiced ease, his months of preparation evident in every movement. The overseer's punch met only empty air, throwing him slightly off balance. The miss was more than just a failed attack. It was a crack in the foundation of Thomas's reputation. For 20 years, his first punch had been enough to end most fights before they truly began. The psychological impact of that initial blow was as important as the physical damage it caused. But Marcus had negated that advantage with a simple sidestep, and the watching workers felt a collective intake of breath. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. His counterpunch caught Thomas in the ribs, a sharp, precise blow that made the older man grunt in pain. It was the first time in 20 years that anyone had landed a clean hit on the fighter, and the shock of it rippled through the watching crowd. The sound of knuckles meeting flesh echoed across the plantation yard like a gunshot, and several workers flinched at the familiar sound. "First blood to the boy," Samuel whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and hope. The old man's words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of prophecy. Samuel had witnessed every one of Thomas's fights, had seen strong men reduced to broken corpses in a matter of minutes. But this was different. Marcus moved with a confidence and skill that none of Thomas's previous opponents had possessed. There was hope in the air for the first time in decades. Thomas recovered quickly, his years of experience taking over. He had been in countless fights, and one lucky punch didn't change anything. The sting in his ribs was sharp but manageable, and he used the pain to fuel his anger. He came at Marcus again, this time with a combination of jabs aimed at the young man's head and body. The overseer's fighting style was brutal but effective. He relied on his size and strength to overwhelm opponents, using his reach advantage to keep them at a distance while he pounded them into submission. His fists were like hammers, each blow designed to break bones and crush spirits. He had developed this style through years of violence, refining it with each kill until it became a perfect instrument of destruction. But Marcus was ready. He weaved between the punches with an almost supernatural grace, his body moving like water around Thomas's attacks. The young man had spent years studying the accounts of Thomas's fights, learning the overseer's patterns and preferences. He knew that Thomas favored his right hand, that he tended to drop his guard after throwing a combination, that he became reckless when frustrated. When Marcus struck back, it was with surgical precision, a blow to the solar plexus that left Thomas gasping, followed by an uppercut that snapped the overseer's head back. The combination was perfectly timed and executed, each punch flowing into the next with practiced ease. Thomas staggered backward, blood flowing from his split lip, his eyes wide with shock and growing concern. The workers began to murmur among themselves, their voices growing bolder as they witnessed something they had never thought possible. The fighter was being outfought by someone half his age, and the implications were staggering. Some of them had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining what it would be like to see their tormentor brought low. Now, watching it unfold before their eyes, they could barely believe it was real. Ruth, the middle-aged woman who had been on the plantation for 15 years, felt tears streaming down her face. She had lost a son to Thomas's brutality 5 years earlier, a boy who had been caught stealing food for his sick mother. The memory of that day still haunted her dreams, but now she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope for justice. Thomas wiped blood from his split lip, his eyes narrowing with rage. "Lucky shots," he snarled, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The taste of his own blood was foreign and disturbing, a reminder of his own mortality that he had forgotten over the years. "Let's see how you handle this," Thomas continued. But even as he spoke, he could feel doubt creeping into his mind. This wasn't going according to plan. Marcus should have been on the ground by now, broken and begging for mercy. Instead, the young man stood tall and ready, his eyes bright with determination. He charged at Marcus like a bull, his massive arms spread wide to prevent any escape. The charge was one of Thomas's favorite tactics, using his superior weight and momentum to overwhelm opponents. He had crushed men against fence posts and barn walls with this technique, their ribs cracking like kindling under the impact. But Marcus didn't try to run. Instead, he stepped into the charge, using Thomas's momentum against him. A perfectly timed hip throw sent the overseer crashing to the ground, dust exploding around his body as he hit the earth hard. The technique was one Marcus had learned from an old fighter in Charleston, a man who had taught him that size and strength meant nothing if they could be turned against an opponent. The crowd gasped collectively. Thomas Blackwood, the man who had terrorized them for decades, was lying in the dirt at the feet of Joshua Johnson's son. For a moment, the plantation was silent except for the sound of Thomas's labored breathing and the distant cry of a night bird. The image was seared into the memory of every witness, the mighty overseer brought low by the son of his first victim. But the fighter wasn't finished yet. He rolled to his feet with surprising agility for a man his size, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. The fall had jarred his spine and scraped his back raw against the rough ground, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the damage to his pride. No one had ever put him on the ground before, and the experience was both shocking and infuriating. "You think you're clever, boy," Thomas snarled, spitting blood into the dust. "I've been fighting since before you were born." The words were meant to intimidate, but they came out sounding desperate rather than threatening. Thomas could feel his aura of invincibility slipping away with each passing moment. The workers were no longer cowering in fear. They were watching with rapt attention, their faces showing a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Thomas's next attack was more calculated, more vicious. He feinted left, then drove his right fist toward Marcus's temple with enough force to kill. The punch was thrown with all the skill and malice he had accumulated over 20 years of violence. If it connected, the fight would be over, and Marcus would join his father in death. But Marcus had been watching, learning, adapting. He caught Thomas's wrist in mid-swing and twisted, using the overseer's own strength to hyperextend his arm. The technique required perfect timing and leverage, but Marcus executed it flawlessly. The sound of Thomas's shoulder joint popping was audible to the entire crowd, followed immediately by the overseer's scream of pain. The scream was unlike anything the workers had ever heard from Thomas. It was raw and primal, the sound of a man experiencing genuine agony for perhaps the first time in his adult life. The overseer had inflicted such sounds on countless victims over the years, but he had never imagined that he might one day produce them himself. Thomas managed to break free with his left hand, catching Marcus across the jaw with a backhand that sent the young man staggering. Blood flowed from Marcus's mouth, and his vision blurred momentarily from the impact. The blow was powerful enough to drop most men, but Marcus had trained his body to absorb punishment. He shook his head to clear it and spat blood into the dust. "That's more like it," Thomas growled, flexing his injured arm. The shoulder was damaged but still functional, and he could feel adrenaline masking the worst of the pain. "Now you're starting to understand what you're up against." But even as Thomas spoke, he could see that his words were having little effect. Marcus's eyes remained clear and focused, showing no sign of the fear that Thomas was accustomed to seeing in his opponents. If anything, the young man seemed more determined than ever, as if the taste of his own blood had only strengthened his resolve. The two men circled each other warily, both breathing hard, both marked by the violence of their encounter. The workers pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the combatants. In the fading light, their faces were masks of tension and anticipation. Some of them had begun to whisper prayers, asking whatever gods might be listening to, grant Marcus the strength to finish what he had started. Marcus spat blood into the dust and smiled grimly, the expression transforming his face into something fierce and predatory. "I understand perfectly. You're a bully who's never faced anyone who could fight back. That's about to change." The words stung Thomas more than any physical blow. Deep down, he knew there was truth in them. His reputation had been built on beating down the weak and defenseless. Marcus was something entirely different, a trained fighter with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The young man represented everything Thomas feared most, someone who couldn't be intimidated, someone who fought back. They came together again in a flurry of punches and grappling. Thomas's experience showed as he managed to get Marcus in a headlock, his massive arm crushing down on the young man's throat. The hold was one of Thomas's favorites, a technique that had ended several of his previous fights. He could feel Marcus's pulse against his forearm, could sense the young man's growing desperation as oxygen was cut off from his brain. For a moment, it seemed like the fight might be over. Marcus's struggles grew weaker, and Thomas felt a surge of familiar satisfaction. This was how it always ended, with his opponent broken and helpless, begging for mercy that would never come. He began to squeeze harder, preparing to finish what he had started. But Marcus had learned more than just how to throw punches during his years of preparation. He drove his elbow back into Thomas's ribs once, twice, 3 times, each blow landing with increasing force and precision. The impacts were like hammer blows against Thomas's damaged ribs, and he could feel something crack under the repeated assault. The pain was excruciating, and Thomas's grip loosened involuntarily. Marcus felt the pressure ease and immediately took advantage, breaking free from the hold with a violent twist of his body. As he spun around, Marcus's fist connected with Thomas's nose, the cartilage crunching audibly under the impact. Thomas staggered backward, blood streaming down his face from his broken nose. The pain was intense and disorienting, and for the first time in the fight he looked genuinely hurt. The workers could sense the shift in momentum, and their whispers grew louder, more excited. They were witnessing the impossible. The fighter was being beaten by one of their own. "He's doing it," Ruth breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "He's actually beating the fighter." The words spread through the crowd like wildfire, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Years of pent-up emotion were pouring out as the workers realized that their tormentor might actually be defeated. Some were crying, others were laughing, and a few simply stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. But Thomas wasn't ready to concede defeat. With a roar of rage, he launched himself at Marcus one more time, his fists flying in a desperate barrage of punches. Some connected, leaving bruises on Marcus's arms and torso, but the young man weathered the storm and waited for his opportunity. He could see that Thomas was tiring, that the overseer's movements were becoming more desperate and less controlled. The opportunity came when Thomas overextended himself with a wild haymaker, putting all his remaining strength behind a punch that was meant to end the fight. Marcus ducked under the blow and came up with an uppercut that caught Thomas square on the chin. The punch was perfectly placed and timed, and it carried with it all of Marcus's anger, all his pain, all his determination to avenge his parents. Thomas's eyes rolled back, and he toppled like a felled tree, his massive body hitting the ground with a thunderous impact. The sound echoed across the plantation like a death knell, and suddenly the night was filled with an eerie silence. The man who had ruled through fear and violence for 20 years lay motionless in the dust. Finally brought to account for his crimes, the plantation fell silent. Thomas Blackwood lay motionless in the dust, his chest rising and falling slowly. Marcus stood over him, his fists still raised, ready to continue the fight if necessary. But it was clear that the fighter was finished, his reign of terror ended by the son of his first victim. Samuel was the first to speak, his voice cracking with emotion. 20 years, he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. 20 years we've waited for this moment. The other workers began to move closer, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and joy. Some were crying, others were laughing, and a few simply stood in stunned silence. The man who had ruled their lives through fear and violence had been brought low by the son of his first victim. It was justice of the most poetic kind, and they could hardly believe they were witnessing it. Marcus lowered his fists and looked around at the faces surrounding him. These people had suffered under Thomas's rule for far too long, and now they were free. But he knew that freedom came with its own challenges, and the real work was just beginning. The physical fight was over, but the battle for their souls and their future was just starting. "What happens now?" asked a young woman who had been working in the fields since childhood. Her voice was small and uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe that the nightmare was really over. Marcus considered the question carefully, understanding the weight of responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. "Now we decide what kind of people we want to be. We can choose to be better than him, or we can become the very thing we fought against." The words carried wisdom beyond Marcus's years, and the workers nodded in understanding. They had seen what hatred and violence could do, had lived under its shadow for far too long. If they were truly going to be free, they would need to find a different path, one that led away from the cycle of brutality that had defined their lives. Thomas stirred on the ground, consciousness slowly returning. His face was a mask of blood and bruises, his body aching from the beating he had received. As his vision cleared, he saw Marcus standing over him, and the reality of his defeat hit him like a physical blow. The man who had never known defeat, who had built his identity on his ability to dominate others through violence, had been brought low by a young man seeking justice for his murdered father. "You going to kill me, boy?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the weight of 20 years of injustice pressing down on him. It would be so easy to end it here, to give Thomas the same mercy he had shown to 29 other men. The overseer deserved death, and everyone present knew it. But as Marcus looked around at the faces of the workers, he saw something that gave him pause. They weren't looking for more violence. They were looking for hope, for a chance to build something better from the ashes of their suffering. Killing Thomas would make Marcus no different from the man he had just defeated, and it would perpetuate the cycle of violence that had plagued the plantation for so long. "No," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "I'm not going to kill you, but your days of hurting people are over." The decision surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. The overseer had expected to die, had prepared himself for the final blow that would end his miserable existence. Instead, he found himself facing something far worse than death, the knowledge that he had been defeated and spared by someone he considered beneath him. Thomas struggled to sit up, his body protesting every movement. "You think this changes anything? Master William will have you hanged for this. You can't fight the whole system." Marcus smiled grimly, understanding the truth in Thomas's words, but refusing to be intimidated by it. "Maybe not, but I can fight you. And I can show these people that bullies can be beaten, that fear doesn't have to rule their lives forever. The words carried a power that went beyond their simple meaning. For 20 years, the workers had lived under the assumption that their situation was permanent, that there was no escape from the cycle of violence and oppression. Marcus had shattered that assumption with his fists, proving that even the most feared tyrant could be brought low. As if summoned by Thomas's words, the sound of approaching horses could be heard in the distance. Master William Blackwood was returning from town, and he would not be pleased to find his overseer beaten and bloodied in the dirt. The workers began to shift nervously, their moment of triumph tempered by the reality of their situation. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of voices. William was not alone. He had brought guests with him, probably other plantation owners or business associates. The timing could not have been worse, and Marcus felt a chill of apprehension run down his spine. The workers began to scatter, their moment of triumph tempered by the reality of their situation. They had tasted freedom, however briefly, and they weren't ready to give it up without a fight. But they also understood the danger they were in. Attacking an overseer was a capital offense, and Master William would not hesitate to make an example of anyone involved. "Go," Marcus told the others, his voice urgent but calm. "Get back to your quarters. Let me handle this." But Samuel shook his head, his old frame straightening with newfound dignity. "We've run from these people long enough. If you're staying, we're staying." One by one, the other workers nodded their agreement. They had tasted freedom, however briefly, and they weren't ready to give it up without a fight. The victory over Thomas had awakened something in them that had been dormant for years, a sense of their own worth, their own power. They were no longer willing to cower in the shadows while others determined their fate. As the sound of horses grew closer, they formed a protective circle around Marcus, their faces set with determination. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the way things were. The old order had been shattered by the fists of a young man seeking justice for his murdered father. Master William Blackwood dismounted his horse with the practiced ease of a man born to privilege. At 38, he was younger than his brother Thomas, but carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real adversity. His expensive clothes and soft hands marked him as a man who preferred to let others do his dirty work. The silver buttons on his coat gleamed in the torchlight, and his polished boots had never known the touch of honest labor. William had spent the evening in town, dining with other plantation owners and discussing the rising tensions throughout the South. There had been talk of abolitionists, of slave rebellions, of a changing world that threatened their way of life. He had dismissed such concerns as the paranoid fantasies of weak men, secure in the knowledge that his plantation was different, that his brother's iron rule kept their workers in line. The scene that greeted him in the plantation yard was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. His brother, the feared overseer known as the Fighter, lay battered and bloodied in the dirt, surrounded by a circle of workers who should have been cowering in their quarters. At the center of it all stood a young man William didn't recognize, his fists still stained with Thomas's blood. The contrast was stark and disturbing. Thomas, who had always seemed invincible, looked broken and defeated. His face was a mask of bruises and blood, his clothes torn and dirty. The man who had ruled through fear and violence for 20 years had been reduced to a pitiful figure, struggling to maintain his dignity in the face of absolute defeat. The other plantation owners who had accompanied William began to dismount, their hands moving instinctively to the weapons at their sides. These were hard men, overseers and slave catchers, who had seen their share of violence, but even they seemed unsettled by what they were witnessing. There was something in the air, a sense of change that made them nervous. "What in God's name is going on here?" William demanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of plantation owners. The question echoed across the yard, but the workers didn't scatter as they normally would have. Instead, they stood their ground, their faces showing a mixture of defiance and determination. Something fundamental had changed in the few hours William had been away, and he could sense it in the very air around him. Marcus stepped forward, his chin raised defiantly. Despite the blood on his face and the bruises on his body, he carried himself with a dignity that commanded respect. "Justice, Mr. Blackwood." Something that's been a long time coming to this place. The word justice hung in the air like an accusation, and William felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was something far more dangerous. The young man spoke with the confidence of someone who believed he was in the right, and that made him infinitely more threatening than a simple rebel. William's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene more fully. His brother was conscious but clearly defeated, and the workers were standing together in a way that suggested solidarity rather than fear. This was exactly the kind of uprising that plantation owners had nightmares about, not a chaotic rebellion, but an organized challenge to their authority. The torches carried by William's men cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. The flickering light illuminated the determination in the workers' eyes, the hope that had been kindled by Marcus's victory. It was a sight that filled William with dread, for he understood what it meant. The old order was crumbling, and something new was taking its place. "You," William pointed at Marcus with a trembling finger. "I don't know who you are, but you've made the biggest mistake of your life. Nobody lays a hand on my overseer and lives to tell about it." The threat was delivered with all the authority William could muster, but his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He had never faced a situation like this before, and the confidence of the workers unnerved him more than he cared to admit. "My name is Marcus Johnson," the young man replied calmly, his voice carrying across the yard with perfect clarity. "And your overseer murdered my father 20 years ago. I came here to settle that debt." The name Johnson clearly meant something to William. His face paled slightly as he glanced down at his brother, who was struggling to sit up in the dirt. The master of Blackwood Plantation was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. William's mind raced back through the years, trying to remember the details of his brother's first kill. He had been young then, barely 18 and more interested in parties than plantation management. But he remembered the whispers, the way the workers had looked at Thomas differently after that day. He remembered his father's stern warning about keeping such incidents quiet, about protecting the family's reputation at all costs. "Johnson," William repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about that troublemaker from years back, the one who got himself killed interfering with plantation business." The dismissive tone in William's voice sparked anger among the watching workers. They had known Joshua Johnson, had respected him, had mourned his death. To hear him described as a troublemaker was an insult to his memory and to everyone who had suffered under Thomas's rule since that day. "The one who was murdered defending his pregnant wife from your brother's advances," Marcus corrected, his voice growing harder with each word. "The one whose death you covered up to protect your family's reputation." The accusation hung in the air like a sword, and William felt the weight of 20 years of guilt settling on his shoulders. He had been complicit in the cover-up, had helped his father craft the story that would protect the family name. They had claimed that Joshua had attacked Thomas without provocation, that the overseer had acted in self-defense. The lie had been accepted without question by the local authorities, who had no interest in investigating the death of a slave. Samuel stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. The old man had been silent for too long, had carried the burden of what he had witnessed for 2 decades. Now, finally, he had the chance to speak the truth. "I was there, Master William," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "I saw what your brother did, beat that boy to death with his bare hands while his wife screamed for mercy." The testimony was devastating in its simplicity. Samuel's words painted a picture of brutality that even William's guests found disturbing. These were men who were accustomed to violence, who understood the harsh realities of plantation life. But there was something about the old man's quiet dignity, his obvious pain, that made his words impossible to dismiss. The other plantation owners were whispering urgently among themselves, their faces pale with worry. They could see the implications as clearly as William could. This wasn't just about Blackwood Plantation anymore, it was about the entire system that governed their world. If they couldn't contain this incident, if they couldn't maintain the fiction of their invincibility, everything they had built could come crashing down. William's jaw tightened as he realized the full implications of what he was facing. If word of this got out, If the true story of Joshua Johnson's death became public knowledge, it could destroy everything the Blackwood family had built. Their reputation, their business relationships, their standing in the community. All of it could crumble in the face of such revelations. Even if that's true, William said carefully, his legal training helping him find his footing, it doesn't give you the right to assault my overseer. There are laws in this state, and they don't look kindly on slaves who attack white men. The words were meant to reassert his authority, to remind everyone present of the legal and social realities that governed their world. But even as he spoke them, William could see that they were having little effect. The workers weren't cowering in fear as they should have been. Instead, they were looking to Marcus for leadership, waiting to see how he would respond.